You are listening to the Christian Music Archive podcast, part of the New Release Today podcast network. I'm your host, Dave Maurer. Each week, I share stories about Christ, community, and music, chatting with musical guests who you will find listed on the pages of the Christian Music Archive. There are thousands of creative men and women who have helped shape the soundtrack of the Christian faith, and we get to hear their stories, learn about how Christ has made a difference in their life, and hopefully along the way, we'll learn how we can be a better part of our community. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the podcast this week. It sure means a lot that you choose to spend time with me and my guest. I sure don't take that time for granted. Each week, I conduct more interviews for this podcast. In fact, this week, I have 3 conversations scheduled that I'm pretty excited about. And each week, I send an email to my contributors giving them the opportunity to suggest things for me to talk about with my guests. And I'd like to invite you to be a part of that list. If you'd like to become part of the question crew, all you need to do is send a donation of any amount. You can do that using the donate link over at christianmusicarchive.com. When your contribution comes in, I add you to the list of esteemed individuals helping write questions. Won't you consider helping sustain the work I'm doing both on this podcast and on the website? Head over to christianmusicarchive.com/donate. And thanks in advance. I really appreciate your support. Okay, enough about business. Let's get to this week's interview right after this word from Mercy Inc. We'll get to our interview in just a minute, but I'm excited to first tell you about the work of Mercy Inc. in Colombia. They have a project there called Soy Satura, which is helping feed kids who are crossing the border from Venezuela to go to school. You see, the schools in Venezuela are not very good, so moms are taking their kids to school in Colombia where they can get a decent education. Now, the Colombia government is willing to provide an education to these kids, but they won't feed them like they do the Colombian children. And most of these kids from Venezuela are from really poor families that don't even have money to feed their kids. So Mercy Inc. is taking soybeans to create both food and juice that they are able to feed these kids, sometimes the only meal they will get in a day. I sure would like to share more about the Soy Satura project and how you can get involved. Would you head over to the website christianmusicarchive.com/mercy so you can learn how you can help feed these kids? Our intent is to make a difference around the world through this podcast, and one of the ways we do that is through the work of Mercy Inc. So again, head over to christianmusicarchive.com/mercy and discover how you can make a difference to the children of Venezuela. Buck Storm is an author who has penned numerous fiction and nonfiction books. His current book, The Sound the Sun Makes, follows the adventures of Detective Early Pines into the world of Hollywood. He's also written Finding Jesus in Israel, an off-the-bus peek at people and places that make Israel such an amazing destination. But as a listener, I can hear you already saying, wait a minute, Dave, I thought this was a music podcast. Well, never fear. Buck is also an accomplished musician. In addition to his solo projects, he's collaborated with the likes of Randy Stonehill, Bob Bennett, and Phil Keaggy. And so let's get to know a little bit more about this Renaissance man. Welcome to the Christian Music Archive, Buck Storm. Welcome, Buck.
Hey, thank you. That was a very nice introduction.
I think it was mostly true, wasn't it?
Yeah, probably 80%, I would say.
We'll figure out which 80%, right?
No, that's nice. Thank you.
You actually started music before you actually started writing, isn't that correct?
Yeah, I've started music way back in the 80s, actually. I had a band when I was in high school and grew up in Arizona, Yuma, Arizona, and landed in LA because that's where the music was happening. Mm-hmm. By way of New York and street music in New York. And so that's a whole long story. But anyway, wound up in Los Angeles with some buddies playing music. Yeah. And so it's been a long haul with music for me. And it's really one of my first loves.
So are you still doing music? The last thing I saw was 2016, I think it was Blue Sky, an acoustic collection. Is that your most recent solo project?
Yeah, that was an interesting kind of thing. I recorded that mostly just on a computer on the road, kind of in hotel rooms and bits and pieces as I was traveling. And because I've always wanted to just kind of put together a acoustic thing. But yeah, so that's been a while. And then after that, I sort of got really, really busy with some writing. And so the road situation slowed down quite a bit, other than
Sure.
kind of one-off, concert things here and there. But yeah, lately, the last 6 months or so, my son, who's a worship leader at a local church here, we've put a band together called the Buckley Storms, and that's been a blast. I mean, we're out playing all over the place. It's become quite a scene here in Coeur d'Alene, where we're from.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, just went into the studio with him, and so I'm just kind of watching the torch pass to the next generation of actually talented people, and it's really cool to see.
Yeah.
So,
well, we were
yeah.
talking a little bit before we pushed record about the fact that, a lot of good music is coming from Christians in the main marketplace rather than just Christian musicians making Christian music. So that's kind of what you're doing with Buckley Storm, right?
Yeah, I have a theory that we can really get wrapped up in the Christian kind of ghetto, get really into our narrow groove. And I don't know, when I look back and see really the way Christ walks the earth, and how he really got down into the stink and the grit and the filth of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that that's what we're doing, but I am saying that I think you have to let yourself live some of the human experience outside of the Christian market, I guess I would say, and there might at times be quite a dichotomy between Christianity and the Christian market. It just depends on the times and the place. But
well, and I think we, especially in Western culture, have kind of made church a country club where we go and we hang out, and rather than the locker room where we're getting prepped to go do battle, as it were, out in the mainstream. And I think that's one of the things that we as Western culture are missing.
Yeah, I've gone through my my ups and downs, even recently, and especially maybe recently, with really questioning so much of what's happening in the church, and you talk about Western culture, especially. I mean, when I was just having coffee with a good friend the other morning, who's another very, very experienced Israel traveler,
Mm-hmm.
and we were talking about being in Israel, and he was explaining an experience he had being in the synagogue one day. He was invited for Shabbat to the synagogue, which is pretty unusual for a Westerner
Right.
to in Jerusalem to be invited. And so he said, going in, not speaking Hebrew, other than being able to say good morning and hello, basically.
Yeah.
He was one of the things that really moved and surprised him was that the synagogue was like in this big U shape, and there was a table in the middle, like you could probably picture, where they bring the scrolls down, bring the Torah down, and they start reading. And he said he had no idea who the head rabbi even was. It was just like this big interactive. Everybody's there reading, they're discussing, they're talking, they're praying, and so I mean, you look at that from like an Eastern culture to where we've gone in the West with our Western church, which is very performance driven. You've got celebrity pastors on, but it's very easy for anybody to get bitter about that, and I hear a lot about the bitterness, but I also have to step back and say, well, Jesus works with us, in us, and in our culture and where we are today. So I don't ever like to beat up the church or the Western church, Eastern, anything like that. I think Jesus will meet us and work with us. So yeah, it's called a personal savior. So we're all on that personal walk. We're all on that journey. And I find that I feel like I'm getting stupider every day. Where I used to be a genius, believe me. I could debate and talk and, maybe argue you into my point of view.
Yeah.
And then, hey, then I be right. And you get to still be the same guy you ever were. We haven't progressed anywhere, know? And now I realize, I don't know. I think God is so big and so huge. I think he's bigger than the church. I think he's bigger than even scripture. And I think scripture is infallible, and I love scripture, but God is so massive that every day I'm just sort of wondering, Yeah. And maybe as I progress in years and stuff, I start to look at, the future and think, man, I mean, I just don't think I know anything,
Well, and as I've been doing these conversations and talking with a lot of people, I'm recognizing a lot of different, very realistic truths that I'm hearing from people, and realizing that God is like a diamond. There's so many facets that I'm looking at one or maybe two. You're looking at one or maybe two. Maybe they're the same facets, but probably they're not. And I think God, like you said, is so much bigger than anything that we can understand, that our measly pea brains couldn't comprehend everything that is God.
Yeah. And it's such an odd time, especially in America right now, where everybody's, shooting spit wads across the aisle, and everybody's angry. And I see it in the church. I mean, we live in North Idaho, which, as you can imagine, is very, very, for the most part, very right wing. And so you have here a lot of politics getting mixed up with churchianity, and you see that a lot. But you also see the other side too. And I don't know. I've really been hunting hard for love these days, and that's what I want to press into that, because one thing I do know, there's so many things that I feel I don't know, but the one thing I do know is that in my life, from a very, very young child, I have known the love of God. Going through a childhood that wasn't wonderful, like so many people have. The one constant, and I can't explain this other than it has to be supernatural. The one constant has always been God's love in my life and God's presence in my life. And that even goes for the times I was being an absolute idiot and running far from the Lord and being, lucky to be alive at times. But I've always known he was there looking over my shoulder, and I've always felt his love. That has been a constant. And I think, and I know that will always be a constant, even when this world is a distant, and all our political crap, everything we fight about and think is so important right now, even when that's a distant memory, God's love will still be the constant. So that's the one thing I can be sure of. Everything else, I don't know.
Well, let me press into that, and I don't necessarily need to have details unless you're wanting to share them, but how were you able, in the wallowing in that muck of life, to sense that God's love was there with you? I mean, what was that? What did that feel like? Because a lot of people right now says, I don't even think God loves me anymore. So what was that for you?
I think for me, it was, it's changed through the seasons. I mean, as a child, living with different relatives as my parents were spinning out and doing weird things, and I always seemed to have God present. I remember just a quick story, being really, really young. I think I was maybe fifth grade, and I was living not with my parents, and going to a new school, and there was a Bible on a shelf, and I remember at that young age saying, "Hey, you know what? If you're real, I sure like to hear from you," because I was scared, I was alone, and I remember I opened the Bible, did the old open my Bible, close my eyes, put my thing, and the first thing I said is, "I have not given you a spirit of fear," and that was my first real sense as a child that I can remember going, "Wait a minute. There's something to this. This isn't fake." And I've seen that through the years, gosh, so many ways. I think one thing I have seen is God protecting and even blessing me when I least deserved it. I mean, really, when he should have been just punting me off a cliff. I've seen him take me into my arms and rescue me in so many ways that I just can't deny the fact that he was there and present and real. Even when I was pretty open rebellion to him, So I mean So I don't know. Like I said, I think it's different for everybody. I think it's a personal walk. But in my life, that's the way it's been. Things have happened, circumstances have come about that there's no explanation. They're just too unreasonable to not be supernatural, to not be miraculous, And so I've seen that over and over again in my life.
Well, and you talked about earlier the seeking of love, and as I read the scripture, that boils it all down. Jesus boils it down to two things: love God and love others. And,
absolutely.
And what does that look like? I think that's what we're all probably for the last millennia and more been trying to figure out. What does it mean to love God and love others? And so,
and then, it sounds like the simple, dictate, but how do you do that, man?
Yeah.
I mean, most people are not very lovable, right? And so you gotta just trust God and say, hey, I might not feel it, but I need to act it,
Yeah. Well, you talked about moving from Arizona, did some time in New York, did some time in LA chasing music. What was it about music that you saw was worth chasing?
My dad was a bluegrass musician when I was a kid, and there was always music around, whether it was in a parking lot behind in a festival, or somebody passing a bottle around or whatever, there was music happening. And so I always wanted to play. And then, I've actually thought about this a lot lately because I'm still in touch with a lot of my old friends. But back when I was maybe late teens, I got involved with a group of guys in Arizona that we started to play music. and they became, I think, in a lot of ways, my surrogate family. I really wanted a sense of family, and those guys really became that for me. And I loved music. And the weird thing for me was I've made a living at being a musician for so long, but I've never really been fascinated with becoming like, I guess all my friends wanted to be, Eddie Van Halen in the 80s, and I wanted to be Chris Christopherson. I love lyrics, John Prine and Dylan, and I love I was always a words guy.
Yeah.
People say, hey, who's your greatest musical influence? And I'd say like J.D. Salinger. It's like I've always looked to words. So over the years as a writer, I've kind of gravitated. You talked about Randy Stonehill and things, or the Phil Keaggy, Bob Bennett project, and I would be more of like a words guy than, obviously. Well, when you're standing next to Phil Keaggy, you're not the guitar guy.
Right.
I think a lot of it. I love the art. I just have always been passionate about art, and so it drove me to New York, or to L.A. and to play, and we were playing in the 80s in L.A. You played in the Originals clubs. It was like, and those were the years of like Stryper.
Yeah.
All these guys. There was a group I think it was called Sanctuary or something like that. There was a big group of Christian musicians that were playing all the clubs there.
Okay.
And even though we weren't metal guys by any stretch of the imagination, but we kind of fell in with that group a lot. And we were out playing a lot and doing that in Los Angeles. And there was quite a scene there. It was really an interesting time to be alive as a musician in the 80s. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, that was kind of the music had, especially in modern culture, music had kind of taken off. The hippies had said, okay, we're going to make music for ourselves. And then in the 80s and 90s, it was like, okay, now let's experiment. What can we make that sound look like? And now I feel like we're just doing cookie cutter stuff instead of that real exploration, trying to figure out new ways of making sounds. And
lately, I don't know, modern Christian music I don't listen to a ton of it, so I don't pretend like I'm an expert, but the stuff I hear reminds me a lot of 80s U2. It's like, it sounds like it's kind of been done, but there was a real sense of experimentation back then. I remember somebody gave me one of Larry Norman's cassettes, and I remember listening to that thing, because you talk about a words guy.
I was just going to say,
And I remember one of our first times playing in LA, I looked down on the front row, and there's this guy with long blonde hair, and I suddenly froze, because I think, oh, man, I think that's Larry Norman.
Oh yeah.
And it was kind of cool. Afterwards, he came straight up and walked up to me. I don't know why, for some reason. Maybe we had made eye contact and said, hey, man, I'm Larry. Hey, you guys want to go get something to eat? And we went out and hung out with Larry Norman for the evening. And I thought we were just massive rock stars at that point, sleeping on couches and not, eating borrowed food. But that was pretty cool. But those were the days, where there were a lot of, in all music there, it was a really, the 70s were stretching into the 80s, and people were trying to figure out, hey, what's next? What can we do different? And it was a pretty cool time.
So was it while you were in LA that you hooked up with Randy Stonehill?
No. Well, no. In fact, it's funny. I was at a studio in LA back then. I don't remember why. Somebody invited us down to hear a mix. It was actually, somebody was mixing, I think it was a Petra record.
Okay.
And so we were sitting there, and the producer said, hey, let's call Stonehill. And they were joking around about something, and called Randy Stonehill. And I was like, man, what would it be like to just be able to pick up the phone and call Randy Stonehill,
Yeah.
But I didn't meet Randy really until some years ago. It was, I had done some touring and done a lot of Israel travel, and with a specific ministry. And I was invited to go as a writer with Randy and Phil Keaggy and Bob Bennett. You'd mentioned that, and both do a tour of Greece and kind of the journeys of Paul, and then this very strange, quick Israel trip. And it was funny. We were I think we had to catch a plane from Athens to Jerusalem, or to Tel Aviv.
Okay.
And it was, something had gotten mixed up, and we got on this plane. It was literally like one of those buses with like chickens hanging from the roof, it was like one of those things. We got to Tel Aviv, and I think only one guitar made it. And so we got to travel around with passing a guitar around and stuff. But anyway, I got to know Randy on that trip. We came back, and the purpose was to write that record, basically Songs for Israel. And I hit it. I hit it off with all of them. I love those guys.
Yeah.
I still talk to Bob and Randy quite a bit. I haven't heard or talked to Phil in quite a while, but Randy and I really hit it off kind of as, just hanging out and writing. And so that sort of turned into, hey, let's write some more songs together. And, he's an incredible songwriter and challenged me greatly. And so we sat in a lot of hotel rooms and wrote written songs. And so that's kind of how I came to be with Randy. And that sort of turned into, hey, let's do some dates. And we did quite a bit of traveling and quite a bit of touring. And yeah.
Fun.
Actually, no, you know what? Let me go back a little bit. I'd met Randy before that. And for some reason I was doing a couple opening dates for him.
Oh, fun.
And I remember being in, I forgot all about this. I remember being in, we did a date in a theater in Moscow, Idaho, which is just south of Coeur d'Alene, about maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours.
Yeah.
And we had to drive back. And I remember asking him, I'll never forget it. It was a beautiful summer night, full moon. And one of after some of my wandering days, one of the ways that God really got me back was through a book that Melody Green wrote called No Compromise, the life of Keith Green. And that book essentially wrecked my secular music career and brought me back to the Lord in a lot of ways. And so I was very curious about Keith Green, and Randy was mentioned in that. I knew his history with Keith. And so I asked him, hey, can you tell me about Keith Green? And so I got to sit in a van driving through a summer night for, an hour and a half, 2 hours, just listening to firsthand Keith Green's story. Yeah. That was amazing. That was really my first Randy experience. Yeah. And then we, went our separate ways, and it was some years later that we got back, hooked up, and I don't even know if he remembered who I was, but, getting back for that trip to Israel and doing that record. So, that turned into Stonehill and Storm, a couple recording projects, which I'm still very proud of. I think those are great recording projects. I think there's some really good material on those.
Breath of God 1 and 2, right?
Yeah. So Breath of God 1 was sort of a feeling out the waters, and Breath of God 2 is essentially just fleshing that out, adding, I think, 4 or 5 songs, going into a studio down in Los Gatos, California, with a guy named incredible engineer and producer named Joe Weed, who's done a lot of Ken Burns documentary stuff. We wound up doing recording with him. And so that, turned into a really great project.
So was the trip to Israel, you mentioned that you'd gone with a group that, a mission organization, was that kind of the genesis of the book that you put out called Finding Jesus in Israel?
I mean, I guess if you go way back to the genesis, but that was a trip where, you go to Israel as a tourist, and it's a wonderful experience, especially for a first timer who's, grown up hearing Bible stories. But one thing I didn't really love about it is you're kind of on a bus with a lot of Americans, and you get off the bus with a lot of Americans, and you see a site, and you get on the bus, and you go to a gift shop, and you go, please exit the gift shop. That's what I wanted to name that book, but they wouldn't let me. So I'd gone back a couple times, just kind of as traveling with a lot more freedom. One time going with a buddy, we rented a car, drove all over the place, just spent time with actual people. That's the kind of traveling I really enjoy. And then I wound up taking a couple small groups, doing it really differently, not the buses. I'd rent a van in Tel Aviv, just go rent a van at the rental place, take like 5 or 6 people, and we just go drive all over and see, you could still go to the sites, but, going to a grocery store, going to a pub, going to wherever we felt like going, into a coffee house and meeting, people and seeing people. And so that's kind of more what happened with that book. I had my literary agent had to ask me for a couple of years, hey man, it would be really cool if you wrote a book about some of those experiences. And I kept telling him no, because I know a lot of very, very brilliant thinkers and David Hawking and Josh McDowell, and like these guys that can write real books about Israel and really about eschatology and all these things. And I'm like, man, I'm just a songwriter and an experiencer. And so he finally said, hey man, look, can you just write one chapter? And so I wrote a chapter about this kid I met on a place called the Ramparts Walk, which is on top of the old city wall in Jerusalem. Okay. And it's this Palestinian kid in a SpongeBob t-shirt that conned me out of some money, even though I knew I was being conned the whole time, and him and his buddy. And so I just said, I'll write about that kid, because I think that's Israel to me,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and about how in the end, how precious that little guy is to God, you know? And
Mhm.
so I wrote a chapter, and it was, you know, kind of funny and kind of, you know, I don't know, just the way I think about Israel. And
Sure.
anyway, that turned into a book deal. We got an offer from Worthy Publications. It's now on Hachette Books. Yeah, my agent called me back and said, "Hey, they want you to do this, but they want it in 90 days."
Oh
And
my
so,
goodness.
so I had 90 days to write that. So basically, I sat down and I'd pray, go hike a little bit, and then come back and write. And that's how that book came to be. And I really like that book. I think it's very kind of personal, but it's been neat to see the evolution. I think it's 30 or 31 fairly short chapters, and each
Okay.
one's kind of a story. And it's sort of, I get emails sometimes from people that have used it for a devotion, or,
Mm.
you know, like a monthly devotional. And it's been really cool. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind of how that all came about. That's called Finding Jesus in Israel.
So I'm curious about the transition from rock star or rock star wannabe, maybe, to somebody who's
A
now
lot of,
writing long form writing into writing books. That's not a 3-minute song. Now we're talking about 31 chapters. How did that transition take place for you?
yeah, yeah. And that 31 chapters was a short one. Like I said, I grew up as a words guy, you know, and I mean, I've been an avid reader since I was really young. I mean, reading Louis L'Amour books under the covers with a flashlight, you
Hmm.
know, and moving on to everything I could possibly ever read. And I still read a lot. And I always thought that I'd be a writer. Actually, I loved music and I loved playing, but I remember when my wife and I got married in '89, on our application for our first apartment, I lied and said I was a writer, and but I was planning on being a
Yeah.
writer. It was some years ago. I had written a couple chapters, and I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago now. And I just thought, you know, I really want to do this.
Mm.
And so I just went ahead and wrote a book, and knowing nothing about writing books. So when you say a 3-minute song, I figured, hey, it's like writing a really long song. You
Yeah.
know, it's
Yeah.
like, how hard can it be? It's just words, right? And so it was kind of nice, you know, being in the somewhat in an industry, you know, they don't cross over a lot, but I did know, you know, I had some friends that knew people. And so my manuscript, I call it a manuscript. This is very loose language right here.
Okay.
Got passed on to a really nice lady. Her name was Kimberly Woodhouse, and she read it, and she called me and said, "Hey, you know, I think you have a really good voice for writing, but you have absolutely no idea how to write a book." And she beat me up pretty good. But she was so nice. And she said, "Hey, I'd love to just, you know, coach you, talk you through some
Yeah.
things." And she was just nice enough to take the time to do that. And I went back and I read every possible thing I could read on the craft. I studied, I kind of put myself through Google school, you know,
Yeah.
bought a bunch of books,
Yeah.
and it took some time. I rewrote that book. It was called The Miracle Man. It was my first novel. And I rewrote that probably 3 times, I would think.
Okay.
And then I got to the point where, okay, I think I'm ready to step forward. And at that point, you say, you know, as anybody who's in the author world, you know that you either go traditional publishing or self-publishing,
Right.
you know, and there's a lot
Okay.
of both and a lot of merit to both. I felt like I wanted to go traditional publishing at that point. I don't know if it was an ego thing or what. I think I wanted somebody to say, yeah, you can actually do this. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I, so the first step for that is you have to somehow secure a literary agent. That's
Mhm.
your only, you know, that's your doorway into the
Gotcha.
publishing world. And so I'd read a lot about that, and they say, hey, it takes, like, you know, you could spend 8 months, a year, 2 years trying to secure a literary agent. But I thought I'll start the process, and I just sort of threw it up to God. I picked 12 guys. I remember I picked 12 literary agents online. I did a query letter, did everything they
Hmm.
wanted on their website, sent off my manuscripts, and just decided I'll just wait and see what happens. And I got a call back in 2 hours from a Heartline Literary, Jim Hart at Heartline, and he said, "Hey, I want to be your agent." And
Wow.
I thought, well, no, that's just too easy. That can't be right. You know, like, how
Yeah.
much do I have to pay you? You know? And he's like,
Yeah.
"No, I really do." And so I told him, well, let me think about it and pray about this, because it was so fast, you know.
Yeah.
And I kind of remember coming up to my office, sitting down and praying, and God just sort of impressing on me, "Hey, you asked me, and
Yeah.
I answered." And so I called Jim. I said, hey, let's do it. And so, yeah. So anyway, he took that book, and that got a publishing deal, turned into a couple more publishing deals, and they've been kind of plugging along ever since. And so that's kind of how it all happened. And I still am trying to figure out how to write a book. You know, I get a lot of good reviews. I get a lot of nice people, but I also know that I'm figuring it out as I go. It's an endless craft. I
Oh,
mean,
I'm sure.
it's endless. So yeah.
I've
Yeah.
tried to write one book now. It was a training book, and it's like, that's a lot of work. I can't imagine somebody making that their full-time gig of just, I'm going to sit down and write. That's not where my
Yeah.
mind works.
Yeah. It can be pretty all consuming. I've actually taken, last year was pretty stressful writing the last book. I got COVID early in the year, and that knocked me back for about 3 weeks. And that 3 weeks sort of turned into, I don't know how, but I just lost a bunch of time in there and wound up getting, past my deadline. It was a lot of stress. I was writing constantly, not really having a life. And so I finished that finally. Now I'm taking a few months sabbatical, which is really cool. I feel like I can breathe again, smiling again.
Yeah.
So,
Well, as I was looking at your books, you've got a good mix of fiction and nonfiction. And typically I see most people do one or the other, but you kind of do a little bit of both. The things that were interesting to me is you have 2 books out that you've just released called, and I wrote them down, The List and The Light. And I love the premise of these. You're taking biblical times and as close as possible being accurate with biblical times, and then writing a story into that. Talk a little bit about those 2 books. That's a very interesting idea.
Yeah. So I would call those fiction. I mean, I would still call those fiction, but fiction with the caveat that we worked really hard. I worked really hard to make sure that these books were absolutely, having been to Israel quite a few times. And actually, I was approached by a ministry to write the first book. A guy had an idea that he thought it would be really cool to write something like that, but he didn't know how to write a book. So I prayed about it, thought about it. And his idea was, what if we took something by, like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, those 2 guys, because those are the 2 guys that took Jesus's body off the cross. And then, well, one of them was a Pharisee, Nicodemus, we know. The other one was a wealthy man. So probably, the Bible's not specific, but probably a Sadducee, which is like, it's like saying Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton got together to take Jesus's body. Somebody from such polarized opposite.
Interesting.
And I thought there was a fascinating story in that, because what would, these guys would have had the, prophecy, they would have had scripture. Both of them experts, although they approached it, saw it completely differently. If you know this, the points of Pharisees and Sadducees, but somewhere in there, they found common ground to realize, hey, this is the guy, this is him, this is the Messiah. And so I said, yeah, I think I'd like to write this book. So I just took it and ran with it and wrote a book with, there's a lot of prophetic angle in it, what they would have read, what they would have seen. There's kind of a study guide at the end of it too. I thought that was a fascinating thing. And I had never really seen anything or read anything that I thought would have really laid out, particularly Jerusalem, as like what it was really like in the day, which is a fascinating place, even if for those who have been there as many times as I have. It was a completely different place. I mean, you had the city of David, you had Mount Zion, you had the temple, which was this immense and amazing place. So writing fiction, true fiction, I guess you'd kind of call it, against that backdrop was really kind of thrilling to do. And it's been great. So that was, the book was called The List, which basically takes place through the kind of the 3 years of Jesus's ministry. His active ministry. It ends just before the resurrection, and The Light picks up at the resurrection and follows through to Pentecost. So it's just a 50-day journey. But what I really enjoyed writing in those was, even though these were spectacular times and massive ideas and massive world events, I think, because this is the God I know, that God was still acting personally with a loving heart towards people. And so, and so the second book still deals with Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, but also with a girl who doesn't even have a name. Her name's Sister, and she's basically a lower city prostitute, and her journey to find identity and value in her crashing into the person of Jesus. So it's been great. Great books for ministry. I get so much response from those books, people saying how they've affected their lives. And
So do you find it easier to write that kind of a book where you have kind of this fact-based background that you're playing off of, or you're like The Sons the Sound Makes, which is completely fiction? Okay, granted, you're in Hollywood, you've got some landmarks that people would recognize, but you're making everything up there versus where
yeah,
the Bible account, you've got it. Well, and I think before we pushed record, you said that anytime that the characters interacted with Jesus, you're actually using Jesus' words out of the Bible. So there's a
yeah.
little bit of a narrative that's already built for you. How does that difference work for you?
I find the writing that where you're trying to be actual fact, you're being factual. There's a scene in the first book that takes place at Passover, and so there's so much going on at an early first century Jewish Passover that we don't really catch with our Western eye. There was so much study that went into that book, and so much conferring with scholars and both Christian and Jewish. There was so much that went into that.
Yeah,
And
I'd
then
imagine.
for me, a heavy responsibility to say, okay, I'm dealing with, I'm not writing about a detective in Hollywood,
Right.
I'm not just making this junk up. This is
Yeah.
like, I have a responsibility to before the Lord for this. And so I find it both rewarding and very, very difficult. And writing what has been labeled literary Americana, which is my other kind of genre. My other
Right.
books, my other novels are mostly small town America stuff. I don't know. That's just fun stuff. I
Okay.
mean, you're just making stuff up. I'm not an outliner or planner when I write. I know a lot of writers and a lot of guys that, one friend of mine up here is Frank Peretti. He lives
Oh, sure.
locally, and
I didn't
I've
know
heard.
that.
Yeah, he's here in Coeur d'Alene, but he said he spends about 2 years just planning a book out, and
Oh, wow.
or I've tried to do that. I'm horrible at it. I'm not nearly organized. I rarely know what day it is, and so I'm more of a kind of a fly by the seat of my pants guy when I write, and that's a lot of fun for me.
Yeah.
I mean, you're just letting the characters run wherever they're going to run, and I think of it as just writing down the movie that's playing out in my head,
Sure.
and so that's just kind of free form and fun, and there's no responsibility, which of course is more fun. But then, you've also got the reward of saying, hey, I think I've really written something of value here, which I hope all of it has value. I hope, because, as an artist, you want everything in you to speak from your heart. But so I do find the historical fiction, historical true fiction more difficult, I would say.
Well, and I guess what you alluded to earlier is the fact that when you were doing Google University to learn how to become a writer, you forgot to look at the planning course, right? You don't have to.
Or if I looked at it, I thought, no, I don't want to do that. That sounds horrible. Yeah.
Well, looking back over the stuff you've done so far, writing books, traveling in Israel, traveling with, musicians, New York, do you have a specific moment in your life you look back and go, oh my goodness, God, I can't believe that you put me in this place at that time and let me experience that? You have kind of, I call it a pinch me moment.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, probably so many. Just as far as this being a music archive, I would think one of them was when I was younger, like in my very, very early days. I don't remember how, but I got a copy of one of Phil Keaggy. I think it was Town to Town, his record.
Oh my goodness.
And listen to that, and listen to that, and listen to that, and listen to that. And I remember standing on stage after Songs for Israel and Phil Keaggy playing. In fact, there's a YouTube video of it. I wrote a song on that record called The Garden, and Phil does this nylon string guitar solo live on stage.
I have tarried in the garden, I've rested in the sound of Spanish hymns, filled with the mystery of pardon and the wondering of grace bestowed to men. In the garden, I stand in the half-light with the dust of runes on these traveling clothes, caught somewhere between the angels. listen to a soldier's pain, fallen friends and forgotten wars. And as she spoke, the sky began to rain. I watched the crowd as they turned to go. In the garden, the air is filled with minarets and mission bells, and all the things an aging soldier never tells.
And I just remember standing there going, oh man, that's Phil Keaggy playing on a song that I wrote. It was amazing to me. I mean, that was like, for me, that was one of them. The other one I remember from a Christian musical history perspective, being in a church in Georgia and doing Love Broke Through with Randy on stage and thinking, wow, man, I mean, this is a song that really spoke to me when I was a kid, and those were two, musical moments for me that were big. But I mean, I've had a very strange life. I've met so many celebrities and famous people in both Christian music and secular music over the years, and had a lot of experiences. But those two really stand out when I really think about it. Yeah. And then
That's
of course
cool.
There's, when I got my first publishing deal, that was, I felt like I was in a dream a little bit. Like,
Yeah.
you find somebody, there's some validation there. Just taking it out of that realm. I remember one time I was in a prison with a friend of mine. He's an ex-biker. Now he's a pastor, and I was doing some ministry in a prison here in Idaho. I was playing a song, and I just felt called to play a different song. And so I kind of stopped in the middle and had my eyes closed when I was playing. And, you feel the Holy Spirit, press in, and you can feel sense that God's doing something heavy. And I remember opening my eyes and seeing everybody in the place, everybody in the whole room, like down on their faces on the ground.
Wow.
And God doing an interaction. And I remember in that moment thinking, man, Buck, you are so insignificant in this moment.
Wow.
Because God has an appointment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a big one. I remember another time in that same doing ministry at that same place, and I remember because it was winter. I think it was 20 below zero. It's up in the mountains, and we had to load out into this van, and I had a song that I written about and for my grandpa called the Fisherman song. I wrote it years ago, and I remember I didn't play it live very often, but I felt kind of called to play that night. I don't know why. I just felt in the mood to play it.
Sure.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
I'm not like answering not like Elijah, and I played it, and I was out, and there were some guys, some of the guys in the orange jumpsuits, taking out trash, and one of them said, "Hey man, can I talk to you?" And the guard kind of held him back, and then decided to let him come talk to me. And I'm freezing, I just want to get in the van.
Yeah.
And he rolled up his sleeve, and he had a deep sea fishing pole on his tattooed on his forearm. And he said, "Hey man, my grandpa," because I told the story of my grandpa in the night, and he said, "My grandpa used to go down to Mexico and he'd take me fishing as an excuse to tell me about Jesus." And he said, "Obviously, I didn't listen,
Yeah.
But he said, I want to let you know I accepted Christ tonight, and I want to change." That was a big one for me. That was like, those moments where I think as anybody, I think anybody of faith, it doesn't matter if you're in the arts or where you are. The moments where you go, oh man, that had nothing to do with me. I just got to be, God's kid who he hands a paintbrush and lets him play around with the paint on the fence while God's really painting.
Yeah.
You can be that guy and to see that. So there's been so many of those over the years, little things. And I can only hope that we'll hear about a lot more when we get to heaven, things that happened and that you don't even know about. But I think it's pretty wonderful that God sometimes will give us little glimpses like that, just to let us know that, hey, I know it's 20 degrees and all the hairs in your nose are frozen, but there was a reason, for it. So, yeah.
And after all, I think most humanity, we want affirmation that we're doing what's right. And to be able to hear God speak would be wonderful. But oftentimes it's these, okay, I see. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we've been really blessed in that, we have done a ton of small stuff. And I mean, small churches, a lot of rural places, a lot of farm towns, everywhere from, the South to Hawaii to Central America to Israel. I
Yeah.
mean, my wife and I have traveled and done a lot of stuff. And we've been really blessed to see kind of the backside of all of it, and we never, we're not big stars or anything. We just got to tag along and watch God work in some pretty wonderful ways. And sometimes it wouldn't even be me. So I remember times being in towns where my wife had an appointment there. You could see that God had an appointment for her to minister to somebody,
Yeah.
and me just, I guess we're going to hang out here for a couple of days while she does her thing, and
Yeah.
I've seen it so many times that God is real and has his own will and exists outside of my will. And if I ever try to put him in a box, he just splinters it. And so, it's pretty wonderful to see.
Well, what's coming up next for Buck and the author or the musician, or what's in the next season after your sabbatical here?
Yeah, a couple things. I'm getting the itch to write. I have to sit down and write a slew of articles for Guidepost devotionals. I've never heard of Guidepost.
Oh, yeah.
I write quite a bit for those guys every year. I just realized that I have a looming deadline. I have to do that. Probably start this week. We've got my third book in the Sound the Sun Makes. The first one was called The Beautiful Ashes of Gomez. The second one is the Sound the Sun Makes. And the third one, Venus Sings the Blues, is going to be out, I think in the late spring, early summer. So that's coming out. And then something that's been a blast. I mean, I can't even explain how fun it is. It's just playing with the Buckley Storms with my son. We just got out of the studio and have a single called Wings that'll be hitting Spotify here probably in the next couple weeks.
Okay.
With some stuff and going back in the studio, and I think that's going to turn into a vinyl here within the next few months or 6 months, maybe.
Sure.
Maybe an EP vinyl. So that's been a lot of fun, and just watching that happen and explode and realizing that even though you're not playing necessarily in churches, but you see God's hand moving, and you hear these little weird stories, and you go, wow, man, no matter what I do, it seems like God gets involved. And so, it's so fun.
So people who are intrigued by your music, the Buckley Storms, what's the best place for them to find more information about you and the work you're doing?
Yeah, for me specifically is very, very difficult to remember. It's buckstorm.com.
Very good.
Yeah, and sign up to the email list. I try to be somewhat faithful. I'm not very good at it, but they've got a pretty extensive email list. We try to send things out, let people know what's happening with new books. Sometimes giveaways, free stories, music if that's going on. The Buckley Storms, the BuckleyStorms.com is the Buckley Storms website, but that'll also, I'm sure, be crossed over to my website too. So a lot of stuff going on. And I'd love to connect with your listeners out there if anybody wants to say hello.
Buck, I end every episode the same way. Every Saturday, I send out a newsletter asking folks to pray for musicians. We have a number of people who've committed to doing that, and people who are not necessarily doing music right now, but who have. So how specifically can we be praying for you in the weeks and the months that are coming up?
I think just that God would illuminate our path. We're always making decisions in life, and I know that I need to... I'm looking for some specific direction from the Lord for a third book in the List and the Light. I think it's going to be called The Letters, and going to maybe deal with some of built around the Apostle Paul somewhat, I think. So I'd love to hear from the Lord with some inspiration on that. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to look like yet, but I feel it bubbling under the surface. I have a feeling it's going to come, and so. So just direction on future writing projects and music projects and just life in general. I always feel so blessed because our life here in Idaho is really pretty darn good. God just takes care of us. Everybody's healthy in our home. Our kids are walking with the Lord, and we have 2 granddaughters now that are just light in our lives. But I think God's protection, God's providence, and God's direction, that's what we all want.
Thanks, Buck. I really appreciate you taking time to chat with us today. Isn't it fun going behind the scenes with some of these creative people? I especially enjoyed hearing about Buck's God appointments, as he called them, times when he was in the right place at the right time for God to use him to minister to someone. I think about the freezing prison yard where he talked with the inmate who gave his life to Christ, or for all the study and preparation Buck's done to write books that have inspired action in people. All of these God appointments were nothing that Buck could have planned. So how did Buck prepare for those God-appointed encounters? Well, he dug in. He studied using Google University and other things. He practiced and he honed his craft so that he was ready for God to use him. So what would it look like for you and me to be prepared for the God appointments in our lives? 1 Peter 3:15 says it this way, "Honor Christ and let him be the Lord of your life. Always be ready to give an answer when someone asks you about your hope." Part of being ready is to know what you believe in, to have that relationship with Christ. And that's likely going to come through your daily walking with Jesus, recognizing what he does for you. Being grounded in God's Word will definitely help with that. Helping know the details of Jesus' teaching provides us a reference for our beliefs. Through those experiences and our relationship with God, God is going to provide us divine wisdom that we read about in Luke 21. Jesus says, "I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict." This week, let's work on preparing for our God encounters. Let's commit to being aware of the difference a relationship with Jesus makes in our own life, so that when the opportunities arise, we are prepared to give an answer for the hope that we have. This week, I featured Buck Storm's song, "The Garden," with special guest Phil Keaggy. This song comes from his album Songs for Israel, and I'd like to thank Buck for the permission to share it with you. As always, I encourage you to stop by Buck's website and pick up a copy of his music or even his books directly from his website. This is the best way to support the work he is doing, and I'll put a link to Buck's website in the show notes. As always, thanks for joining me for this conversation today. I am grateful that we get to spend this time together each week hearing stories about God's amazing faithfulness. As a regular listener to this podcast, would you reach out and say hello? You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn simply by searching for @CCMExchange. Or you can also drop me a line on the webpage christianmusicarchive.com. Next week, I'm talking with Greg Martin of the Kentucky Headhunters. Greg is a guy who works in mainstream music, but has a heart for God. He's also done some great work with Christian artists like Daryl Mansfield and Bride, so be sure to come back next week to hear Greg's story. To close things out this week, I'm going to do what I always do. I'm going to remind you this: God loves you. In fact, he's crazy about you.
It's time for another Mischievous Maurer's Miscellaneous Misquotes.
A Mexican magician tells his audience that he's going to disappear on the count of 3. He says, "Uno, dos, poof." He disappears without a trace.